Go.
Our space agency has abandoned these artifacts of one of man's greatest achievements. It says it simply can't afford to preserve the past for the wonder and admiration of future generations. The question is, can it afford the future? A future for which it already is planning and building ever more sophisticated vehicles for ever more adventurous explorations in space. This is our story tonight. Outer space. Can we afford to go? Here is where it all began, a quarter of a century ago, where a massive rocket stood here at Cape Canaveral, poised for a trip to the moon.
All still go on the Apollo mission, the flight to land the first men on the moon.
It seemed then, 25 years ago, that we could see forever, deep into space where humans would fly, where humans would explore and live among the stars. We exulted in the dawn of the age of space. Today's visionaries are as enthusiastic, as busy as ever, planning the future and building for it. First, an international orbiting space station called Alpha, from which they would launch the exploration of Mars. But as liftoff approaches, the political weather is overcast. Critics argue that the cost is too high, that man need not go, that space exploration with robots is cheaper than with human crews. And many ask how such expenditures can be justified when there is so much of urgent necessity demanding expenditures on Earth. If the critics prevail, it could mean the end of human space travel for the foreseeable future. What the critics see is an annual $14 billion budget for NASA, $6 billion of that devoted to human spaceflight, the only disputed area. NASA says this $14 billion is only 1/4% of the gross national product. It's closer to 1% of the federal budget. That's just about what the government spends on crime and justice, and considerably less than it spends on education, the environment, and health services. Critics want to stop spending on human space flight entirely. Defenders insist it's essential to keep the momentum going.
If we wait too long, we'll lose the energy, we'll lose the will. We are the carpenters of an invisible cathedral. We're building a cathedral across space in which we all participate. We have theories about the speed of light travel, that sort of. We don't know how true any of that is, and right now we're going to experiment with deep sleep for a lot of the astronauts. We've certainly put that in enough motion pictures.
This is the first time that men have been put into hibernation before departure. Why was this done?
Well, this was done in order to achieve the maximum conservation of our life support capabilities, basically food and air.
Science fiction filmmakers and writers have been bringing their dreams of the far distant future to the screen for many years. When I was a child, it was pure fantasy to conceive of people rocketing to the moon, let alone to Mars and other planets, of people whisking through outer space in special suits, of wars between Earthlings and outer space creatures.
Careful, Flash, they're turning for an attack.
Exploring and traveling through outer space has captured the imagination of humanity from perhaps even before recorded history.
Who are you? A scientist, like yourself. Where do you come from? From a planet, yet unknown to you.
I think it's quite likely that there are some real aliens out there.
and I'd like to get to know them. And we could design living creatures which could actually live in space and be spacecraft all by themselves. So you could have things which I like to call space butterflies, which look a little bit like butterflies. That means to say that they're flimsy and big, and they can fly with huge wings, which are actually sails in space.
We dream dreams. We will be at nearby stars. I don't know how far out we'll go, but we will be at nearby stars in 500 years. And we'll not just go to nearby stars, but with the magic of our communications and our observation systems, we will have reached out right to the edge of our universe.
I'm one of those people that believes in the dream, that believes that if we don't explore, that we become inward-looking and only.
I offer my services as science officer.
That we don't expand our horizons.
With all due
And
respect,
I'd hate to see us lose that. I think it's important to explore and discover. And that if that is the final frontier, I think it's worth examining.
What are the motivations for space, this life force, humanity's quest to participate in the whole universe? It is the quest for meaning down here. I think meaning is a very, very key word.
science fiction and science fact are getting closer all the time.
Something like 2001 actually had a good deal of realism in it. In that movie, the astronauts, instead of floating in free space, actually lived in an artificial gravity environment. The spaceship turned as they went, and that gave them some gravity. All of our space flight to date has been in zero gravity, and we know that zero gravity affects the body in very many different ways, and many of which are not particularly good for your body. It only takes about a half a year to get to Mars, so to keep a human as healthy as possible on a long flight to Mars, there's a very good chance you'll want to use a rotating spacecraft just as they did in 2001.
One of the great moments of the next 20 years will be the moment when we land on Mars with a real crew of real people, and we stand on the rim of the great Martian abyss, and all of mankind on the earth will stand on the edge of that abyss with us, and we will all weep with joy, as the same way we wept on the night when we landed on the moon. Once we colonize Mars, sometime in the next 50 years, I hope, or 100 years at the most, then, from there on, there'll be giant leaps across space.
By the middle of the first decade of the next century, we could make a decision to go to Mars, not in 20 or 30 years, but in 8 to 10 years. In my lifetime, we're going to see people walking on Mars.
I think future generations will actually live in space their entire lives. We will colonize the solar system.
Before that happens, it will take a series of smaller steps. Space Station Alpha is now planned, will be an 800,000-pound, a 400-ton behemoth, as long as a football field and almost as wide, orbiting 240 miles above the Earth. It will be constructed piece by piece by 34 space flights. By the time it is completed and operating in the year 2002, 6 people will live aboard it for months at a time. Between 1985 and 2002, the United States alone will have spent $28 billion on space station research and construction. Space Station Alpha, under current planning, would be the first step for human flight to Mars. Alpha, a partnership of Russia and the United States with contributions from Japan, Europe, and Canada, would meld the best technologies of each to get humans to Mars quicker and cheaper. I came to Russia, to Star City, to see the Russian contribution for myself. We'll have a report on what I found after we come back. Called Mir, the Russian word for peace. The Russians started building and flying space stations 23 years ago, right after they lost the race to the moon and abandoned their own lunar program. The United States has no equivalent operating system. Instead, NASA's concentrated on human spaceflight in the shuttle program, itself beset by cost overruns, budget cutbacks, and other operational problems. problems familiar to the Russians, too. It is expected that Mir will be the core for the space station Alpha. And to that end, American astronauts and Russian cosmonauts are in what might be called basic training right now in this Mir. Now this is the docking ring. That's the part that fits together.
The docking unit, it will be installed on the space shuttle.
So making the two systems entirely compatible.
Yes.
But what cosmonaut Alexander Serebrov took me through the Mir.
Yes.
So you've got now two modules connected right here.
Yeah, and two here and
so then you
this way.
Two more go like this.
Yes.
So you've got, in effect, a cross of modules.
Cross.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Yes, cross. It'll be cross.
Can I look at that other end of this thing?
We want to come inside?
Yes. Well, that's mighty roomy. This is the main living quarters and operating quarters.
This living area and this area for operation.
Serebrov himself has been on 4 space flights. He spent a total of 377 days in space. That's a couple of weeks more than a year.
That's a treadmill.
How much of that do you do a day?
Each day, 1 hour.
1 hour?
This is 1 hour bicycle.
All at one time? One full hour?
1 hour.
Yeah.
Treadmill and 1 hour bicycle.
The 7th version of the Russian space station, launched in 1986, is still in orbit. Cosmonauts take turns in it for periods ranging from a few months to over a year. While on board, they conduct experiments involving zero gravity and grow crystals that are purer than those that can be grown on Earth. These crystals could be used to build far more efficient computers, a major technological breakthrough with vast commercial possibilities. The United States can't do this because shuttle flight duration is too short. While some Russian cosmonauts are training in Houston, Texas, here in Star City, American astronauts Norm Thagard and Bonnie Dunbar are training to fly with cosmonauts to Mir.
Our biggest challenge right now is having to learn a new system in a different language.
And how long do you spend here now working on this program?
Till the launch, which is March 1st of next year.
And Norm is, of course, the primary crew member, and I'm his backup, so I'll train with him, behind him, and I know he'll stay perfectly healthy.
You're not wishing him any poor luck, right?
Not at all, not at all.
At the same time, she's mindful that I've broken 7 bones in my life. So.
Well, let's hope that doesn't happen. How are you doing working with the cosmonauts? Is this a completely comfortable, cooperative venture?
In general, I would say it is.
They've selected 4 cosmonauts, 2 for the primary crew that Norm trains with and 2 for the backup crew that I train with. And we're both very happy with the crews, with them as a group, and we're really looking forward to the next year.
Recently, the Russians abandoned their most ambitious new space project. They spent millions to build their version of NASA's space shuttle, and they were training 100 cosmonauts to fly it. But then the project became too expensive. They were forced to give it up after one successful unmanned flight. And now, leased to private entrepreneurs, it is becoming but another attraction in Moscow's famous Gorky Park. Meanwhile, at their Energia factory complex near Moscow, the Russians are building and testing new components for their next Mir space station, another step in the long-term goal leading to Alpha and the international mission to Mars. Or perhaps, if the United States drops out, a mission to Mars exclusively done by Russians. Director General of the Russian Space Agency, Yuri Koptev.
Я думаю, что если мы осуществим проект «Альфа», а он рассчитан как минимум до 2010 года, то после его завершения лет через 10-15, наверное, мы могли бы слетать и на Марс.
And what then? Do we flip a coin to decide whether an American or a Russian lands on Mars first?
Я думаю, мы сделаем широкий трап и по нему спустимся вдвоем.
Should man on Mars be our next goal?
It certainly should be one of our future goals, and I would think that The best way to proceed is to build a space station, get the data we need for long-duration flight, and then start moving toward the goal of placing people on Mars.
The American public was excited by President Kennedy's promise to put excuse me, Bonnie, a person on the moon by that decade of the 60s. Would it be well today to give a target date for human on Mars?
I personally hope that we can find another goal such as that. It was certainly one that inspired me as a girl to be on a farm, to go into engineering and come to NASA.
We press something. It's just a question of will and a question of spending the money. If we committed to do it, we could do it within 10 years, I would agree. Realistically speaking, it'll be a bit longer than that. Have my fingers crossed, maybe by 2020.
Well, great. I'll book a board with you, and we'll all go. 2020, this is the date. At Martin Marietta, a NASA futurist, Ben Clark.
If we had a national and international consensus at the governmental level to begin today to plan to go to Mars, I believe we could be there within 10 or a dozen years.
Not only does that consensus not exist for this kind of expenditure, but in the United States, there are powerful voices against Space Station Alpha, and indeed any further piloted space exploration at all for the foreseeable future. And although in Russia it is not a public issue, there are influential opponents of the joint U.S.-Russian space venture, opponents such as the head of the powerful Budget Committee of the Duma, Russia's parliament, Sergei Glotziev. Glotziev took part in the negotiations that led to the American-Russian plans for Space Station Alpha. I spoke with him in the press auditorium at the Duma.
The problem was with the package.
That package, details still under discussion, includes $400 million that NASA will pay Russia over the next 4 years for such things as training and accommodating American astronauts on mere flights.
I don't think so. Alpha project was not considered as separately from other very complicated issues of Russian-American relations in the field of space cooperation.
For Glotziev, rivalry between Russia and the United States over the future commercial use of space technology is a very live issue. Technology such as weather and communication satellites. The Russians have been averaging 100 commercial launches a year at much cheaper prices than NASA, which averages a dozen launches yearly. NASA insists that certain categories of Russian launches be limited and also demands that the Russians raise their prices. This has an impact on Russian interest in moving forward with the United States on Alpha. Your principal concern is that the Russian space industry be protected and have a fair share of the international market for satellite launches.
For satellite launches and, of course, for cooperation in space in general. We're still considering the question whether we should continue to develop our new generation of the space stations, or we shall concentrate our efforts in this joint project. But in order to make final decision, we have to clarify what will be the management of the station, what will be the access to the station, how the profits will be distributed. So we need further development of the details.
So ironically, if there is anything to the Russian claims, American free enterprise is curtailing Russia's desire to become a major competitor in the international space business. And this may hurt plans for Alpha.
I think that we have to introduce much more favorable regime for competition in this sector. And we find this situation is very discriminative concerning the Russian companies.
How do you feel the Duma and you in the economic area are likely to react in the future in appropriating funds for the continuing piloted space program?
Well, I think that in spite of all the political differences in the Russian parliament, everybody understands that promotion of the cooperation in space and development of the space industry is one of the clear priorities.
The Russians don't seem to have much doubt about piloted space flight. They don't debate whether, only how. In the United States, the debate is louder and fiercer.
The idea of going to Mars is crazy.
We'll take a closer look at the debate in America when we return. The debate over whether we can afford outer space travel raises many questions. Can robots do it better and cheaper than piloted space flight? Is there important scientific information coming from piloted space flight? Do piloted space flights result in tangible human benefits? Are the benefits worth the costs? Are there other more important priorities for which the money should be spent? Is there risk in cooperating with the Russians? Let's start with the first question. Can robots do it better and cheaper than piloted space flight? Well, in the case of the moon landing, for instance, the recovery of rocks, couldn't a robot have done that just as well?
I'm not sure that a robot, after it picked up the rock, would look underneath to see what was underneath the rock. I'm not sure the robot would have the same geological knowledge. But that's the scientific part. But would the robot have turned its head and looked back and seen Earth the size of your thumbnail and thought about what's the meaning of that?
Science fiction writer Ray Bradbury.
Well, robots don't work. I mean, they work, but they don't work. We need real human flesh and blood people up there to experience and to tell us how they feel. A robot can't tell you that, huh?
I was strolling on the moon one day in a merry, merry month of December. Now, May, when much to my surprise, a pair of bunny eyes. Oh, is this a neat way to travel? Isn't it great?
In 1993 alone, NASA spent almost $5 billion on robotic missions, more than $6 billion on piloted missions, and almost $3 billion on mission support, for a total of over $14 billion. At the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, physicist Freeman Dyson.
As far as science is concerned, there's no comparison that the unmanned spacecraft are far better. They're not only more cost-effective, they're much more flexible. You can send them where you need them instead of being confined to one particular orbit.
Is there important scientific information coming from piloted space flight? NASA's answer, an emphatic yes. They point to progress in improving drugs for the treatment of cancer, emphysema, diabetes, and damage to the immune system. They've studied the heart, lungs, and our body's systems of balance and hearing, possible only in the weightlessness of space, important to the process of aging. Their studies of the flow of fluids in near weightlessness, they say, have important practical applications in industry. But many scientists and politicians dispute these claims.
I served on a committee to evaluate the space station, and they gave us a list of 48 scientific experiments that should be done on the space station to show us how beautiful it would be for science. And our committee decided, after going through the list, that 46 of these out of 48 would be better done off the space station than on it. You can't just say they're all nonsense, but of course, to a very large extent, they are being oversold.
Senator Dale Bumpers, Arkansas Democrat.
I think there's an assumption on the part of NASA and a lot of the American people, for that matter, who think that simply because space is there and we've more or less conquered space to some extent, that there must be untold benefits out there. They say, well, what are they? Well, they put their heads together and they say, well, we might grow these crystals, or we might find a cure for AIDS or cancer. And might is the key word.
But even critics such as Professor Dyson recognize that piloted space flight is of value.
The Apollo missions to the moon, where you had people on board, did have considerable scientific value. I don't say they were not of use to science, but that wasn't their primary purpose. And unfortunately, they were sold to the public as if they were primarily concerned with science, which of course they were not. In fact, they were an international sporting event.
Out the door now, the commander, Rick House, pilot.
I've always thought that we need both manned and unmanned missions for doing different jobs. And that's still true. I mean, if you really want to explore a planet thoroughly, then no doubt people are very helpful. People are very good at exploring. That's what they do best. In the meantime, of course, there's a different kind of exploring, which is very well done from space with cameras and telescopes. And there, the people only get in the way. You do far better with machines.
With the Hubble telescope, more clearly than ever before, we saw shoals and reefs and islands of stars, clouds of dust that are the nurseries of stars, dwarf stars. Recently, the Hubble found what scientists since Einstein have suspected. There are supermassive black holes in space. Hubble found a huge whirlpool of gas spinning 1,000,000 miles an hour. To keep something that big turning that fast, it must have a black hole at its heart. A black hole as big as 2 billion suns. Is this information of any use? We aren't likely to encounter a black hole on the way to the supermarket, but space exploration has given us a new thing to think about. A thing so big and yet so small, it falls right out of the universe.
Well, the screw is gone.
Despite the arguments, the highly publicized repair of the Hubble telescope was an engineering triumph and clear evidence that there are some space activities that up to this point, only a human being can do.
Bonnie and I both have flown a couple of space lab flights where the major object of the flight was science. I think our experience is there are things that you simply can't do with machines, at least at this point in time. And certainly if things break and it's an automated process, you're more or less out of luck.
What we're doing is research, looking at the unknown, the unexpected. We spend some of our time repairing things, even robots that break down in some experiments.
On your mission next year, what will be the contribution to be made toward the eventual Alpha mission?
We have several problems associated with long-duration space flight. Before we can keep people up for the time periods we would like to keep them in space during our Alpha program, we need to get biomedical data in several areas. We need to determine causes and perhaps treatment or prevention of mineral loss from bone, how to keep the heart from deconditioning, and how to keep, in general, skeletal muscles from deconditioning. Those are our three major problems.
There's just no substitute for it down here on the Earth.
Russian space scientists have been compiling data for more than 20 years on the human body at near zero gravity. But NASA says most of their information was gathered before and after a flight, very little during. NASA scientists want to monitor effects on the body as they occur.
The Mir space station that the Russians have up there right now is the 7th space station they've deployed since 1971. They've done every kind of research that they could think of doing. The Russians will tell you in their private thoughts that they have gotten virtually no benefit out of it. Virtually no research has come out of that that's worthy of the name.
We couldn't find a Russian to confirm that, but a leading Russian space scientist, Rashid Sunyev, told us that some valuable findings have come from the Mir space station. He believes, however, that robotic missions are much more valuable. Do piloted space flights result in tangible human benefits? Are the benefits worth the costs?
I think NASA has gotten to the point where they have a keep busy and find new horizons that cost a lot of money in order to justify their existence.
Copy, Houston. Go for deploy.
To me, these big missions, the space shuttle and the space station, they're simply a total distraction from the real business. And the real business is being done by the small missions very successfully by lots of countries. And I wish the public would understand that these big enterprises are simply irrelevant. They are just a stupid waste of money which have very little to do with the real job. It's just a bunch of people sitting in a tin can for a week and then coming down again.
Ranger touchdown. Commander Houck now rotating the nose down.
The National Space Society's Lori Garber.
I think critics who argue that the space shuttle and space station program don't suit their needs have very parochial needs themselves. Scientists typically want to develop their own scientists. Astronomers may like the Hubble Space Telescope, but they don't necessarily see the value of life sciences studying the physiological effects of space on the human body.
NASA has done and is doing a lot of very worthwhile stuff. Unfortunately, they don't like to talk about anything they've done that's really successful and cheap. For example, there's a lovely science mission which I'm very fond of. It's a little space telescope called International Ultraviolet Explorer, which is still up there and still doing marvelous science. This was a NASA mission which went up 15 years ago and is still going strong. systematically over the last 15 years is observing all kinds of interesting things in the sky, a huge variety of stuff. I mean, I would say it's just as important in its way as the Hubble telescope. The public never hears about it because it was too cheap.
Chemistry is the practice of magic. People think of Teflon and they think of frying pan. You can use it.
Teflon and Velcro are among the better-known spin-offs that have resulted from space research and development. Some advances in computer technology were also developed for the space program. Are these kinds of spin-offs a justification for future space exploration? Astronaut Story Musgrave.
I don't think programs should be sold on spin-off. I think programs you look at directly why you're there. Space needs to be done for space, not for the kind of spin-offs that come from it. Spin-offs can actually justify a program which you shouldn't be doing.
As future space flights are being considered, there are critics who point to NASA's history of administrative problems, projects going over budget. At George Washington University, sociologist Amitai Etzioni.
NASA used to be an efficient, productive agency. It has become a moondoggle. It's a place where job considerations for constituencies, by anybody's account, have a high priority.
One aspect of the space program is certainly a jobs program. These are good, high-tech jobs that people can work on. And frankly, I don't think that's a negative thing about the program.
The space agency calculates that directly and through contractors, it employs 148,000 people. Indirectly, it is responsible for 370,000 other jobs, a total of 518,000 supported directly or indirectly by the space budget. Spending on Space Station Alpha is spread through 37 states and accounts for 20,000 jobs directly and more than 40,000 indirectly. Are there other more important priorities for which the money should be spent?
We're depriving really great universities of this country, starving them on research that would probably have much greater benefits.
I'm not arguing against investing in research or science or progress. I'm just asking that since there are many opportunities to do so, that we survey the field and decide what gets a high attention. Hunger, disease, cancer. Maybe we should spend $25 billion on learning how to solve conflicts so we don't face more Bosnias. I think it's going to produce at least as much results as taking the picture of the hindsight of another planet.
Should you really compare spaceflight with sociological programs which you also need, or should you look at space, what value is it in itself? If you need to go do space, it is of value, then go do it. If it is not, cancel it.
NASA Director Daniel Golden.
Survival is not adequate for America. We've always gone to the frontier. Space is the next frontier. We can't put it off. We just can't put it off. It is mandatory.
To order a videotape of this Cronkite report, use your Visa, MasterCard, or American Express card and call 1-800-652-5566.
This portion of Discovery is brought to you in part by Merrill Lynch.
A new chapter has begun in Merrill Lynch's history in Asia. We are the first American securities firm invited to open an office in mainland China. Being there gives our financial consultants a different perspective, which makes a difference for our clients. The difference is Merrill Lynch.
You've heard all the analogies before. Think of it as caviar for the power-hungry. Or think of it as flying first class for the price of coach. Forget them. This is the Eagle Vision TSI. A sports sedan with a 24-valve, 214-horsepower engine, anti-lock brakes, even driver and passenger airbags. With a car like this, you don't need all those silly comparisons. Eagle Vision. Think of it as an Eagle Vision.
Every year, American business wastes millions of dollars on international calls by using the wrong long-distance company. Now you don't have to waste that money. Introducing MCI's Proof Positive Worldwide. Save up to 50% off typical international calls around the world. Call by June 30th and get 1 month of free long distance. Call MCI now and put your money back in your business.
Everyone knows that Continental flies to cities all across this continent. So what's the difference? Continental flies to over 195 destinations across these continents, islands, and peninsulas. That's the difference. An international business class ticket, an international business class seat. So what's the difference? Continental's business first. For the price of business class, you can enjoy the comfort of a sleeper seat and the service of first class. That's the difference.
Thursdays, nuts and bolts, tools of the trade, the everyday and the extraordinary. Movie Magic, followed by The Secret Life of Machines. Thursday at 10 Mountain, 9 Central on the Discovery Channel.
Something wild's happening at the Wild Animal Park. It's Nickelodeon Days, June 25th and 26th. Bring the whole family for a day of adventure at the Wild Animal Park, where you can see the stars of the Ren and Stimpy Show. Special Roundhouse shows twice daily and Game Lab shows 3 times daily. You may get slimed, you may win prizes, you may meet a Nick star. That's June 25th and 26th at the Wild Animal Park. Gates open 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., grounds open till 10 p.m. No numbers to call, no reservations to make, just be there. Wild Animal Park, admission required.
It's the DOW Dow multi-million-dollar in-store warehouse sale. All 8 Dow superstores are jam-packed to the rafters with sale prices for you. Take this RCA 20-inch remote control color TV, sale priced just $198. Techniques 5 CD changers let you change any 4 display runs and play for only $148. Take Kenwood's high-power digital AM/FM stereo for the car with CD player for only $239. It's here, the Panasonic brand new remote control 27-inch super flat color mounted receiver, sale price $698 at DOW Dow.
We have a $5.5 trillion economy in the United States of America. The space program is $14 billion a year. It's 1/4% of our economy. You could have a feeding frenzy up there on Capitol Hill, and we could cancel a whole space program. It will not change America. But what it will do is it will impede the future.
Senator Bumpers argues that today's space program has lost sight of what it ought to be doing.
Communication satellites, those are all very well. Weather satellites, that's what NASA's mission ought to be. To deploy radars, to deploy Landsats, to deploy weather satellites, all of those things, very legitimate. Even to do some spying, there's nothing wrong with that. We can do all of those things for perhaps $8 billion instead of $14 billion.
1, 0, and liftoff. Liftoff. Americans return to space.
If you take the payload of a shuttle, how many pounds of food and water it can carry to resupply this space station, and you divide that payload into roughly $480 million per flight, and it comes out to about $12,880 per pound of water that we take up to supply those astronauts. I use that figure simply because it points out the astronomical cost of this program.
Where there is that much controversy, doesn't that indicate perhaps that we should go more gradually in order to save some money?
How more gradual could we go? We left the moon in 1972. This is 1994. Do we want to wait another decade, 2 decades, 3 decades?
It would be nice to know what's on Mars. It might even be nice to know whether or not we could do some biotechnology kind of research on the space station or grow crystals that would improve our computing ability. But when you start talking about $62 billion over roughly the next 18 years, at a time when we're struggling to try to save this country economically by reducing the deficit, it is the height of folly to spend that kind of money on a very risky gamble.
Science fiction writer Ray Bradbury.
Well, the people who talk about the money should say we should take $300 billion a year from the war effort. We're still spending that. Put that into the inner cities. Put that into our other problems. That's the big money. We're talking about pennies here, pittance, a few billion dollars as against $300 billion a year.
What about the military role in space? The Air Force Space Command says it is neither involved nor does it have plans or requirements for manned space exploration. Further, it has no position, says the Air Force, should Congress cancel NASA's budget. Is there risk in cooperating with the Russians?
Do you see any value at all in the space station first and the Mars mission in solidifying an alliance between those who are participating in that operation?
Sure, we should work alliances with them. A wonderful place is and would be in enlarging our peacekeeping forces, our peace corps and such. We say, how about working together in something which you and we consider more productive for humankind? The people of the world don't want us to share space stunts. They want us to share in dealing with the problems which bother them, hunger, disease, and war.
The space station is our last national technology test bed. It is the last test bed we have for international cooperation. What is America's words worth? Do you know our international partners before Russia entered have already spent $4 billion? They've committed another $5 billion. What does America stand for as a reliable partner in the world if we walk away?
If anything should happen to Project Alpha, would you be prepared to go it alone in building a space station?
Думаю, да. Хотя это будет сложно.
Committee will be in order.
A House committee vote on next year's space budget is expected soon. A more crucial battle over funding human spaceflight comes in the Senate, the opposition led by Senator Bumpers of Arkansas, which happens to be near the bottom of the list of states where space dollars are spent.
This year, this fall, during the appropriations process, I will make, I believe, my 4th effort to kill the space station. Every year, I get a few more votes than I got the year before. Considering all the publicity that's been generated about the, really the folly of the space station, I think I'll prevail.
Program we have.
Lori Garber.
It will send a signal to the world that the U.S. No longer wants to invest in our future if, in fact, this program is canceled.
We have to search our souls again and say, what are we trying to accomplish as a nation? Are we going to debate the future, or are we going to blaze the trail?
Unless we get our societal problems solved on this Earth. The idea of going to Mars is crazy.
Going to Mars may be a crazy idea for Senator Bumpers, but for Ray Bradbury, it is what life is all about.
The Jews have a saying, to life, huh? To life. And that's what space travel is all about. That is our mission. When the rocket takes off from Canaveral, that's what it says, to life, to our journey across the universe, which is going to last forever. Huh? It'll go on for billions of years if we bring this off. But the important thing is that the human spirit has benefited. We feel closer to all the other peoples in the world.
So we're giving a go at throttle up. 3, 2, 1, burn. 20 to go. Stand by, Tom. Touchdown. Stand by for touchdown. Stand by.
25 years ago, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon.
78 to go. 50 to go. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Today, a quarter of a century later, the adventure of spaceflight still has its own mystique. Story Musgrave.
The magic of the night before is to lie here in the ocean, in the water, to look out at that expanse, which at one time was the largest horizon that we had, then to look out into the heavens, then to look and see the rocket that's going to take you tomorrow out there. Come back in here to the ocean to see the satellites streaking overhead, to think about the amphibian aspects which are at play here, life coming out of the water, some life going back, life taking over the entire planet, every cubic millimeter of it, and then you as representative not only of humanity, but really the life force which is now reaching out to the rest of the universe. You think about humanity's push, humanity's quest, you think about the basic roots of why we're in space. They play in your heart and they play in your soul right here.
The desperate needs today of humans on Earth blur our vision of the future. When we ask whether we can afford more piloted adventures in space, there's an imperative to compare the cost with those of earthly needs. The comparison is not favorable to our space endeavors. But in fact, the equation doesn't add up. No legislator, nor government bureaucrat, nor pleader of special causes can offer a formula that would guarantee that money saved from our space program would find its way into those urgent needs: health and housing, education, crime. In the absence of that promise, we can only look at our space program as it stands alone. And we come to the conclusion that we should not abandon a program that pushes human capabilities, that recognizes that failing to accept the challenges before us invites stagnation, that there are practical benefits not alone to the future, but even under this generation, an understanding of our environment, not the least among them. And perhaps beyond all other benefits, the promise of discovery of things of which we cannot even imagine, the golden grail of any pure or applied science. As with all things in this period of a strained national economy, we must demand a strict accounting by our space agency, both on the financial and the mission side. We have a right to ask for economies wherever they can be achieved, and we have a right to ask that there be careful consideration of the potential benefits before missions are assumed and expenditures committed. Outer space, can we afford to go? The answer is the present environment would indicate we cannot, but the alternative is worse. We cannot afford not to go.